Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Olivia. I am a facilitator with the water adaptation community at the GCA. I'd like to introduce our chair for today's webinar, Ms. Micah Van Ginnigan, a water leader with 25 years of experience spanning 5 continents. During her career, she has helped provide millions of people with access to water and sanitation services. She has interspersed executive positions with extended periods of living and working in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. She served as a UN Assistant Secretary General at the International Fund for Agricultural Development and as Chief Executive Officer of SNV Netherlands Development Organization. She's held various leadership positions at the World Bank and managed the World Bank's $5 billion energy portfolio in Western and Central Africa and its $6 billion water portfolio in South Asia. Micah is currently an independent consultant and serves on the governing board of IHE Delft. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Olivia, and good morning to everybody in the Americas, good afternoon to everybody in Europe and in Africa, and good evening to those of you who are tuning in from Asia. Very exciting to be here with a Delta and climate adaptation community. So welcome to this seminar, Mobilizing Finance for Climate Adaptation in Delta. This is the first seminar in a 4-part series. So if you like this, you will come to the other 3 as well. And we will discuss future-proofing climate adaptation of deltas, coast and small islands through action, political will, and through financing. These webinars are presented by the International Panel on Deltas and Coastal Areas, which is an initiative of several Dutch organizations. We'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Let me thank the organizers, the speakers, and the participants for joining. So today we focus on deltas. 500 million people live in delta and coastal urban regions. I'm one of them. I live in the Rhine-Meuse-Scheldt Delta. Some of humankind's great civilizations emerged in deltas, and that's not a coincidence. They have fertile floodplains and easy access to the ocean. So today, vibrant cities and thriving agriculture and industrial centers exist along the world's deltas, and they have a stunning ecological variety and landscapes. But we also know that these low-lying deltas are prone to floods and that climate change makes floods worse and less predictable. So deltas are very vulnerable to climate change. So today we're going to explore what has worked to protect deltas against climate change. So the core objectives of today's webinar is that we want to share know-how of strong water climate adaptation strategies and practices in deltas across the world. We have a very great panel with very different experiences from different deltas. We want to engage with experts across the world to highlight emerging knowledge and identify gaps. And we want to, importantly, explore how to mobilize climate adaptation finance. Who's going to pay for all of this? We have a very busy agenda, so I'm going to be strict on the speakers in terms of keeping time. That's my role today. We will have opening remarks from the Green Climate Fund. We have 4 presentations, and then we'll have enough time for Q&A if all the presenters are indeed sticking to the time allocated to them. And we will close with some updates and opportunities from the water adaptation community. But before we start, I would like to ask Adam Baggi, who's a program officer for the International Panel on Deltas and Coastal Zones at the Global Center for Adaptation, to give us a brief overview of the panel. You're our real host, so Adam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Micah, for your kind words. Welcome, everyone. It is my great pleasure to be here today representing IPDC and also to witness the introduction of this series of webinars. The International Panel on Deltas and Coastal Areas is a demand-driven and results-oriented coalition of the willing. Through evidence-based knowledge, the IPDC supports the national and regional adaptation strategy to mobilize finance for implementation. IPDC will bring water to the heart of climate action, driven by dedicated leadership, knowledge partners, and international coalitions. The IPDC aims to be an effective international platform to foster partnerships and act on improving lives, livelihoods, and ecosystems in the deltas, coastal areas, and islands by supporting the implementation of climate adaptation strategies and accelerating climate actions. The IPDC is an initiative of the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, supported by deltaic and the Global Center on Adaptation. The IPDC's commitment to the Water Action Agenda is to support countries in developing their national climate adaptation plans. The members are Argentina, Vietnam, Singapore, South Africa, Bangladesh, Egypt, Australia, Aruba, Bonaire, Sint Maarten, Sint Eustatius, Curaçao, Colombia, and from the financial part, the Asian Development Bank and the Green Climate Fund. As we embark on this webinar today, I am filled with optimism about the valuable insights and discussions that will take place. And our collective efforts and sharing knowledge and expertise will undoubtedly contribute to the advancement of climate resilience in most regions worldwide. I hope so. Thank you all for being a part of this significant event, and I look forward to the engaging sessions that lie ahead. Thank you again.
Thanks, Adam. A very broad panel that brings together many actors and countries, very impressive. So let me introduce Dr. Amjad El-Mahdi. Dr. El-Mahdi is the water sector lead of the Green Climate Fund. He's a hydrologist by training with over 25 years of experience. Before he joined the Green Climate Fund, Dr. El-Mahdi served as the director of the MENA region of one of my favorite institutions, the International Water Management Institute, or IMI. Prior to that, he was the head of Water Resources Section and Chief Supervising Hydrology at the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia. And he worked a lot there on water assessment and water accounting programs. Mr. El-Mahdi also has a lot of other hats, non-executive roles at the International Water Resources Association, ICID, Water and Climate Coalition, and Water Integrity Network. So a very rich experience. And Dr. El-Mahdi will talk to us briefly about how to mobilize finance for climate adaptations in Delta. And I hope he can give us some insight to that golden pot of money at the end of the rainbow that's called the Green Climate Fund. Dr. El-Mahdi, over to you.
Thanks, Micah, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you really about the key barriers and a challenge to really access to finance to water projects in the Delta region, but also to highlight also some opportunities that are existing at GCF or Green Climate Fund. Just before I start, the Green Climate Fund, it's the world's largest dedicated climate fund that under UNFCCC serve the Paris Agreement, helping the developing countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emission, but also to enhance their ability to respond to climate change and improve resilience. So the Delta region, as been highlighted by Mike and Adam, it's really the region where it's a most vulnerable region for climate change, but also it's already experienced the effect of climate change in a way like the frequent and the severe of floods, drought, sea level rise. And those affect really its devastating, causing devastating impact to the region on their water resources, on agricultural system and ecosystem as well. And in order to adapt to climate change and build that resilience, the Delta region needs really to invest in water projects. However, as we know, there are a number of barriers to access that finance to those projects. And I will frame those barriers as non-financial and financial barriers. In non-financial barriers, they coming through the lack of integrated development planning and capacities, but also the limited investment in terms of innovation of practice, technologies, and business model, but also to find an incentive way for a stakeholder to adapt. But also it's a lack of knowledge and access of information about on the resilience, the low emission practice, and how you monetize the benefits or account for the benefits. But also the lack of awareness of the low emissions nexus practice and the use of ICT technologies as a tool or as a techniques to achieve that resilience. Lastly is really the culture and the behavior barriers as well, and it changing the delta system, and that also need to be considered as one barriers. If you look at the financial barriers, it come across the lack of access, of course, to affordable finance, as we see with the current economic crisis in the world and the decline of the public finance. So there is a need actually to mobilize other source of finance rather than the public, because the public finance will not be able to meet all the demands. So we really need to look at the private sector and how we can blend that finance as well. But if we specifically looking at the water projects and what could be really the barriers within the Delta region, we see one of the biggest barrier is really the high cost of the water project, the underpricing value for the water, but also the water project by itself are often capital intensive. It's difficult to monetize its benefit, but it's also come as too small or too context specific, but also come with a poor business model. And one of the other elements, it's taking long way to pay back period, to pay back that investment. And that make it very unattractive for investor, especially the private sector. But what I wanted to talk to you here, despite all those barriers, there are a number of opportunities that are already available to access finance and mobilize the private sector. But it requires our collective action to be innovative in our way of thinking, in our way of designing the financial model to fund those projects. At GCF or at the Green Climate Fund, what we do here to help really countries to work on Delta region to adapt to climate change. So we provide a number of financial instruments that provide that level of flexibility, from grant to loan, like concessional loan, to private equity, to guarantees, and even to debt swap as well, and blended finance. But in terms of like water project at Green Climate Fund, for example, we have managed to invest almost 3 billion, and that including co-finance, and from our resources around 0.3. So in average, it's like 1-to-1. So $1 being able to raise co-finance another $1. However, what we are really looking for is 1-to-4 to be able really to meet that demand of finance. And the way we provide that finance to help countries to work on a Delta region, we have a different doors that really help the countries to access that finance. One is really like help the countries to develop their adaptation plan. And it's really like 3 million per country. But we also help the country to, as we call it, like a readiness program, which is really a capacity building program, but also in a way to streamline their climate change within their plans, by different sector. But we also help them to develop their projects. So for each project, they can really access, as we call it, project preparation fund. And that's really 1.5 million per project or per proposal. And of course, for project, they can go like minor project, it's like up to 10 million, small project up to 50 million, medium up to 250, and then large project that could really requesting more than 2050. But how we do this? So we do this by really enable the countries by building their capacity, but also we are taking a lot of risk, like all the upfront risk, to de-risk that investment and mobilize the private sector. And one of the key specific criteria for our finance, it's a country-driven fund. So all our funds need to be coming from the request from the countries. And today, what I want to use that opportunity is to encourage all of you to look at how we call for like a water asset transition by treating water as a new asset class in the Delta region as a way of a game change to mobilize the private sector, to accelerate the climate finance, to be able to meet our SDG 6 targets, but also the water action agenda as well in the Delta region. And at GCF, we are really committed to work with you and provide that level of constitutionality or the climate finance by supporting countries to develop, adopt policy, and also establish with them or create the enabling investment environment that's able to identify, design, implement public and private transformational water security projects in the Delta region. But also we are committed to finance that level of transition as well and de-risk that private investment by addressing really the market barriers and ensure the scale of affordability and bankability of those water projects in the Delta region. And finally, we are committed also to support a new financial model. So we are happy to work with the countries, work with partners here to design the blended finance in a way to be able to attract other financier and be able really to meet the demand. Finally, to conclude, GCF really can de-risk investment, mobilize private sector, improve water security and community resilience. And with that, I wanted to invite everyone on the webinar today to really use it as an opportunity to contribute to the discussion and debate, but also aim to come with a set of collection actions. And rest assured, by working all together, we can really help to ensure the Delta region has water resources that will meet the future demand, but also adapt to climate change and build resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. El-Mahdi. And because you have all the money of the Green Climate Fund behind you, I gave you a couple of more minutes, but the other speakers who don't have that fund will have to stick to time. I like it that you distinguish between who pays and who finances. No, you have to finance water assets, but in the end, it's always the user or the taxpayer who actually pays in the end and also reimburses that financing. So I would like to welcome Peter Glas to this webinar. He's the Delta Commissioner of the Netherlands. I actually think he's the only Delta Commissioner in the world. And the position of Delta Commissioner is an independent government commissioner that's legally anchored in the Delta law of the Netherlands. Peter will tell a little bit about what he does himself, but I just wanted to indicate that climate adaptation is a really hot topic here in the Netherlands, and that Peter is an important voice in the Netherlands for advocating on the importance of making the Dutch Delta climate-proof for the long term, and by making sure that soil and water systems play a leading role in spatial planning. So over to you, Peter, to talk a little bit about the Netherlands Delta program. And the Netherlands is one of the richest countries in the world. So if you haven't figured out the finance, then I don't know what other countries are going to do. So give us the financial solutions. Over to you, Peter.
On mute. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And well, I'm not sure if we're the richest, but anyhow, we have a long-standing tradition in keeping our feet dry. I have to share my screen, so I will do that. And hopefully I can do that speedily. Can you see this?
Yeah, great. Go ahead.
Okay. So again, my pleasure to be able to introduce to you to the Delta program. And I have about 10 slides and 14 minutes, and there's too much information on those slides. This is a warning. But maybe at some later stage, you can quietly leaf through these slides, and I hope they contain a lot of information about how we do it in the Netherlands and what developments are taking place also in connection to the financial institutions, because the landscape is changing. So without further ado, for those who are perhaps not familiar with the Netherlands, a small country, maybe 250 kilometers from north to south, on the borders of the North Sea in the western part of Europe. And this is how it looks from space. To the right, you see some of a picture of the rivers which have been trained, groins to accommodate for shipping, very important in our economy, also connecting our country to the hinterland. And at the bottom there, you see the storm surge barrier, which protects the port of Rotterdam, which is also a very important element in our infrastructure and in our economy, obviously. So these are just some pictures to illustrate the conditions of our country, but so we have a vested interest to protect this, and we have done so. This picture shows what would happen if we did not invest in flood safety and in resilient and climate adaptive building, etc. Everything dark blue would be permanently flooded because simply it lies below sea level. Everything light blue and purple would regularly or irregularly flood with the discharge of the rivers, etc. So 60% of the country is flood prone. 10 million people out of the 17 current count, 10 million people live behind the dikes, and 2/3 of our gross our economy, our domestic production, GDP, is produced behind the dikes. So as you can imagine, this is something which is also always at the forefront and still needs more and more investment, also in view of sea level rise and other developments. Now, the Delta program is part of the answer for the Dutch to these changing conditions that we became aware of at the end of the last century. No doubt about climate change and no doubt about what we are faced. This is ongoing. And so climate mitigation is the start of every adaptation plan, and it should be underlined. But my responsibility is with the Delta program, which is a game changer, a paradigm shift, I think, that started at the beginning of this century, and not to react to disasters or near disasters as we have done so for 1,000 years perhaps, but to be proactive and look forward well into this century and beyond. So I won't go through the whole slide, but here is the information about the development. Very key is that annually a program containing 3 plans on flood protection, freshwater availability, and spatial adaptation is presented to Parliament. So the awareness at the political level is very important, as is the awareness on the ground level, obviously. But every year I present this program to the government, and it's connected also to the law. It is enshrined in the law that we do this, and that there is a Delta Fund for long-term investments, and I will get to that later on. Considering the time, I will leave through these slides. So 3 Delta plans on flood protection, freshwater availability, and spatial adaptation, and connected to that a lot of euros. The flood protection costs in new investments in the Netherlands roughly 400 million each year. And we expect that by 2050, we will have enforced part of that infrastructure, about 43% to be exact, of the existing infrastructure, and maintenance on top of this. So 400 million for investments, I think 800 million for maintenance, and that this is covered financially 50-50, 50% by central government and 50% by local government. And this is rather special in our case, and I'll get back to that later also. The freshwater availability, basically, this is a subsidy to change the way we handle our freshwater resources. We used to discharge water as fast as possible to the sea, and now we've come to the conclusion that scarcity is also upon the Dutch, and we have to keep that water as long as possible. And for that, we are changing a lot of the infrastructure, and hundreds of millions are available until 2028 at least. And again, it's a co-production, but it's also co-financing. So central government, decentral, 1 to 3. And in spatial adaptation, how we build our infrastructure, our housing developments and industrial areas, that is spatial adaptation. Again, subsidies are available. But this is just from the central government and decentral government, so the government side of affairs. And on top of this, obviously more and more private investments also are taking place. But central government does play an important role in the Dutch context. Here you have the general setup. The European Union is very important in Europe with its directives, national government, and then we have decentralized branches of government, provinces, municipalities, cities, and villages. The regional water authorities, that's a rather special branch in the Dutch case, which is uncommon elsewhere, I suppose. And we have public drinking water companies, no private drinking water companies, only public. And they have their differentiated tasks and obligations. And so this is a rather complicated setup, but nevertheless, it seems to work rather good so far. Now, it is important to underline that all water services in the Netherlands are publicly owned and operated, unlike many other countries. The total cost of public water management is about 8 billion, which is just a figure. It's a lot of money, but it's approximately 1% of GDP. So it's a lot of money, but what I said before, 65% of GDP is earned behind the dikes. So this is our insurance premium, if you will, from the public side. But most of that, 80%, is financed by local and regional branches of government. So not by the central government, but decentral government. And I am convinced that this is part of our the success so far. So you have the needs are local and regional. You have responsibilities there with the water boards and municipal government, but also the financing takes part there. Now, we do see a changing landscape in terms of the financial aspects. Our central bank is looking into this about sustainable finance, mitigation and adaptation. There's a workforce. So a lot of the reports on this topic will come available, well, towards the end of this year. And I think they should filter in also into the International Panel on Deltas and Coastal Zones, which I welcome very much, obviously, that this has taken place. So Deloitte is also looking at it. Then on the part of research, there's an initiative called Rethink the Delta. Public and private sector knowledge institutes, universities, about 100 million has been submitted, not approved yet, but submitted to the Ministry of Economic Affairs. Also, proving that this link between the conditions and the economy is very clear. And in the upcoming conference, which I organized, and for those who are in the neighborhood, the 9th of November in Groningen, also there from last year on, the financial sector is very much on our agenda. Now, if you look at public-private flood risk financing and insurance, it's part of the flood risk part. You see three lines of defense, if you will. The risk prevention, in which a lot of the public funding is covered by green Dutch state loans now, and also water bonds by the Netherlands Water Bank, Water Board Bank. Billions have been, collected, if you will, on the international capital market. So there is a great willingness, apparently, on the international capital market to invest in green projects through these loans and bonds. Mitigation, risk mitigation. I mentioned the subsidies that are available, but in any case, it's €1 from central government, but more than €1 from decentral branches of government. And then we see changing requirements, for instance, for building. But also, I expect that the mortgage and insurance conditions will change, even in my country, in relation to flood risks and other aspects connected to climate adaptation. So the premiums and the mortgage rates will change depending on this. Something the Dutch are not so good at, perhaps, is risk recovery, because we've kept our country safe for such a long time. Many other countries are much better at this aspect of recovery after the disaster. There are some instruments in place, insurance, and there is a fund, a central fund available, but that is something which is really under development. Now, the Delta Fund I mentioned is well, the basis of the central government funding part. About 50% of that 1.5 billion annually, which is added annually, is available for investments, and about 48 for the maintenance by the agency. The abbreviation RWS stands for Rijkswaterstaat, the national agency. And they had a celebration this week. They exist 225 years this year. And if you look at the graph to the right, you see changing budgets for different objectives until 36. About 21 billion is reserved. So it's not in the bank, but it's reserved on the state budget. And 22 billion is projected towards 2050. So this provides stable and adaptive financial outlook, which I think is very important for this future. Now, my final slide, some lessons learned from 12 years, 13 years almost of the Delta program and the Delta Fund. We have decisions to be made in an uncertain future. If you look towards the future, there's uncertainty. We are operating in the mist, and the implementation also in an uncertain future. Now, decision making in this uncertain future calls for adaptive strategies. Nevertheless, clear objectives. The standards of safety for the dikes are defined by law in the Netherlands, and other standards are being developed. You have to be adaptable to the actual conditions because they might change. So you need to avoid lock-ins. So this is on the drawing board, how to avoid these lock-ins and link short-term agendas, not only water agendas, but agriculture, industry, even social developments, demography, with long-term water challenges. And sometimes water is a condition to reckon with, but also water provides opportunities. There's always these two sides. And the implementation benefits from flexible measures that can be speeded up or slowed down according to conditions. Building with nature is very much something that we promote, not to fight against the forces of nature, because you will, in the end, you will lose that battle, but work as much as possible with the forces of nature, building with nature. At the same time, be robust in your design. And spatial planning, it was mentioned by Mike in the introduction, should not be based on economic or demographic or other considerations alone. No, water and soil conditions should prioritize from day one when you put something on the drawing book. And then the stable budgetary outlook that was provided by the Delta Fund and the co-financing conditions with the other branches of government towards 2036 and 2050 have also proven to be important for well, the way that we try to be confident about living in this vulnerable delta for generations to come. And with that, I hope I kept within the time. Maaike, I thank you for your attention, and I will stop the sharing of my presentation so we all see each other again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. Very action and information-packed presentation. Probably 3 points I take out of this. The first one is the level of investment. This is only probably affordable in a rich country. No, you talk about $8 billion per year, 1% of GDP. I did a small calculation. It's about $500 per capita per year for each inhabitant of the Netherlands. That's a lot of money. But you do good things with that. The second thing that really struck me is that half of that investment is in operation and maintenance. When we talk about financing, it's not only building stuff, it's operating and maintaining it. And the third point that struck me is the very important role of the public sector, of different levels of government. And actually the private finance you talk about is very different than what Dr. Elmadi said before. Dr. Elmadi of the Green Climate Fund was talking about project by project private finance. What you're talking about is how governments actually raise bonds to finance the sector as a whole. So different models of private finance. We'll come back to that. So let me go to Dr. Gholam Rabbani. Very different circumstances, but also very important delta in Bangladesh. Dr. Rabbani is the head of the Climate Bridge Fund Secretariat of BRAC in Dhaka, Bangladesh. BRAC, another of my favorite organizations. So we have a very nice panel here. Before joining BRAC, he held senior research positions at the Bangladesh Center of Advanced Studies. And he's been working on environment and climate change issues at national and regional level for about 20 years. Key contributor to different documents such as the 2005 Bangladesh National Adaptation Program of Action and the second and the third national communication to the UNFCCC. And he's been involved in climate negotiations with the UNFCCC process since 2008. His current areas of interest include climate finance, climate change adaptation assessments, adaptation technologies and practices, loss and damage, and migration issues. So Dr. Gholam will talk about the Climate Bridge Fund that he currently works on, and I think he has a very rich experience. So without further ado, Dr. Rabbani, over to you for a maximum 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I will share my experiences in Climate Bridge Fund, in next 10 minutes. So it's a great pleasure, and I am honored. I'm very pleased to be here to share these experiences. As the time is very limited, so I will be brief in the introductory slide. Well, this Climate Bridge Fund was established in 2019 by BRAC with support from the government of Germany through KfW. And this is a very small climate finance mechanism which actually support the registered NGOs in Bangladesh to implement adaptation actions in selected urban areas to address problem of the climate migrants. So since 2020, we are covering 26 districts of the country through 22 projects. So in 2020, we supported 4 projects. In 2021, we supported another set of 4 projects under climate change window and 14 projects under emergency response window. We have 2 windows under climate change, Climate Bridge Fund. And this financial mechanism is grant support that we receive from the government of Germany, as I was saying, and we strongly encourage the co-financing from the other donors and also from the implementing partners. So this is the brief of the Climate Bridge Fund. But how this Climate Bridge Fund became very innovative and unique. Let me just share 6 major elements. First of all is the bottom-up approach. How do you select the priorities? How do you select the projects? The interested NGOs and IPs, implementing partners, they consult with the target communities, local communities, about their problems, about their needs, and they prioritize in consultation with the target communities and submit the project idea with a concept note to the CBF Secretariat. And this is how we make sure that bottom-up approach is quite ensured during the project designing. And the local ownership, how do you ensure the local ownership? When they design the project idea, they must share their project ideas with the local government authority, which means the municipality or the the city corporation authority or the other government organizations. So they need to discuss with the stakeholders, and these projects ideas also need to be aligned with the local plans or the national plans, maybe the national adaptation plan. And the other small element of this local ownership is at least one of the implementing partner has to be local organization. So INGOs are welcome to submit their proposal, but INGOs cannot submit the project or implement the project alone. They have to include at least one local partner to implement the project. That's how we promote the localization and locally led adaptation. So innovative practices, we encourage the innovative ideas at the local level. There are quite good number of examples. I will not go in detail, but if needed, then probably I can share some of the examples. But the fourth element is gender and socially inclusiveness. Gender inclusion is a major criteria for CBF's funding support. The fund prioritizes the projects that are inclusive, addressing gender and the most vulnerable groups and communities. Just to give you one example, we encourage at least 50% of the total beneficiaries have to be women. And one project that I can share with you is targeting 100% women in Khulna City Corporation. This is one of the most vulnerable city corporation area in Bangladesh to climate change. And bridging short-term to sustainable model, one of the three categories of projects that Climate Bridge Fund support is, there are a lot of projects, government projects and NGOs projects, they remain idle at the end of the project. The services and the services remain discontinued because of the problems. So the idea is to develop a project, bringing those idle or dysfunctional services and submit a project so that these projects will renovate the infrastructure, non-functional or dysfunctional infrastructure and services, and make it sustainable, long-term sustainable infrastructure to support the local communities and the climate migrants. And we, of course, generate the knowledge and evidence based on the project experiences. Then how did the fund get started? This is complex image, but I will briefly explain how the fund was started. We received 11.735 million euro from KfW, and this is an endowment fund, which means we invested 90% of 11.735 million euro in government treasury bond. And and the idea is to use the income of the investment from the second year, which means from 2021, and to continue with this income. But what happens in the first year? In the first year, we deducted 10% of the total amount to support the project and bear the expenses of the secretariat, operational expenses. So this is how the it becomes new and innovative to support the adaptation actions in Bangladesh. So how does CBF currently works? There are three tiers of governing mechanism. You can see on the top, BRAC, which is the settler of the fund, and they are the legal partner. They have the legal responsibility to manage the fund and employer of the trustees. And KfW remains the development partner, and they provide no objection to all selected projects and also the financial issues. And if you look at the second tier, principal organs, Board of Trustees, Advisory Committee of the Climate Bridge Fund, and CBF Secretariat. In brief, CBF Secretariat does all coordination and implementation aspects. SECF reviews the projects and recommend the projects to the Board of Trustees, which actually finalize and award the projects, and implementing partners implement the projects. If you look at this project selection process, I'll be very brief to be aligned with the time. You can see from this image on the call for concept note, we circulate it in the BRAC website and also local newspaper, and we also brief the potential interested NGOs, and they submit. There are two stages of proposal submission. At the concept stage, they submit the project ideas in 7 to 10 pages, and we select the project, those project ideas, and we request them to submit the detailed proposal in the second phase. And in the both stage, we present these projects, shortlisted projects to the advisory committee, and they review it, and they recommend this projects, to the CBF Secretariat, CBF management. And then the Secretariat, prepare the evaluation report, and then send it to the KfW for no objection. And after getting no objection and recommendation from the technical committee, we give it to the the trustee board for their final approval. So budget and also the projects are being followed by a rigorous process from the bottom level, identifying the needs, and also awarding by the the trustee board based on the recommendation and the submission from the non-government organization. And the lessons learned, this is my last slide, some of the important lessons that we have learned from our last 4 years experiences is integration of future climate projection remains a challenge, because when we get the concept notes from the NGOs in last 4 years, I can share with you that we have received more than 250 concept notes in last 4 years. In the first year, 98, in the second year, 65 and 45. And then, we had to revise the detailed proposals. And our observation is these NGOs face challenges to integrate or to provide the information on the climate projections. That remains a challenge when they implement the adaptation measures on the ground, because they cannot explain, they cannot really integrate what type of adaptation will be real measures, appropriate measures to cope with or to address the adverse impacts of climate change in 2030, 2040, 2050. So this remains one of the lessons that need to be explored and analyzed. And the second thing that the lessons that we have learned from our experiences is they are not much aware about the co-benefits. Once they identify one option of adaptation, they think like, this is the appropriate measure to address the problems. But there might be, the mitigation benefit that can be integrated with the adaptation measures. So those needs which are being shared by the local target communities need to be analyzed, to identify the co-benefits for both mitigation and also adaptation. And the field-based learning or engagement of communities and local authorities are extremely important. It's not only for implementation, for identifying the problems, for prioritizing the problems, needs, and also monitoring and evaluation. So this is important. And ownership of the land, since we are targeting the climate migrants, the land remains one of the major challenges, because most of the lands are being owned by the either government organization or the private organizations. But on the other point is vulnerability and needs are huge. As you can see, in 2020 we received 98 projects, but we could support only 4 projects. So you can imagine the needs and the support that we are currently providing. And my last point is changes of government policy may affect the financial scenario. Just giving you example, when this Climate Bridge Fund was developed, at the time they considered the 10% tax from the income. Now we are giving 25% of the tax from the income. So this is a challenge that we are currently facing. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabbani, for a very interesting presentation. I think, again, the topic of financial sustainability is very important, and it's impressive how you deal with that both at the fund level, how you use the KfW financing to have a permanent mechanism, but also at the project level for each of the infrastructures that you deal with. One last point on Dr. Rabbani's presentation. He said it very subtly, but they're looking for other donors. So all the donors on the line, please contact Dr. Rabbani for this great project if you want to co-invest with KfW and BRAC. So let's go forward to Leonardo Alfonso. Leonardo Alfonso is an associate professor at IHE Delft, civil engineer working on water systems modeling. And he has a PhD from the TU Delft, my alma mater, but I never made it to a PhD. So Leonardo did better than I did. His research interests include the flow of information in water systems, from data information to decisions, monitoring, network design, and multi-objective model-based optimization. That's all from the PhD. He has worked in many countries, including Kenya, Rwanda, Myanmar, and he's a member of the SEND School. Today, he will present on recent institutional capacity development projects of climate adaptation in 3 Colombian deltas. So we go from Bangladesh to Latin America to Colombia. Leonardo, over to you, 10 minutes max.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. I was also hoping you say IHE is one of the nice organizations you have been as well, given the fact that I understand you are part of the governing board, the same as Peter. Of course, this is a joke. Thanks. Indeed, I'm going to talk a little bit about the projects we have and currently running. Very small projects, but still projects that contribute to coastal adaptation in Colombian deltas, and that is also including a little bit of the part of financing, but on another scale than the ones we discussed in the previous presentations. So the content of this presentation is very quick introduction and context, then a little bit of the funding, then an overview of these projects and some lessons learned. So the idea is that strategic alliance between Colombia and the Netherlands is long-lasting, and there is a cooperation in climate adaptation. And there is this Paris Agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals. These are all overarching frameworks where this strategic alliance lies. And then there is two specific opportunities for making this strategy going further, which is the Delta Coalition and the Delta Alliance. Delta Coalition being this international coalition of governments, and the Delta Alliance a little bit more knowledge-driven kind of group working on this direction. And so a little bit on the Colombia side, we have, well, the Ministry of Environment, called it here Ambiente in Spanish. And yeah, this ministry is under, well, the Colombian government. And then there is this vice ministry, which is the territorial environment planning. And below that, we have one direction that is called the climate change and risk management. And they were very interested on being part of the Delta Alliance. They are part actually of the Delta Coalition. And the idea is that they were approaching the Netherlands to help implementing ministry's action plan for sustainable development of deltas. And here they already have some plan. And there are several points where they saw that the Delta Alliance and the Delta Coalition could help them, for example, to establish working relations with international organizations, also to revise and share good practices for adaptation projects, etc. Now, in terms of financing, so remember these are very small projects, and I will talk a little bit more about them in a moment. So this is the first part. The first project is ProCat project, and this is, entirely initiative from the Ministry of Environment, who approached the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water, and also the Embassy of the Netherlands in Bogota. And with funds of the RVO, the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, they were approaching IHE Delft so that we could come up with a project, ProCat project, that deals with some of the needs of the Ministry of Environment. And the second project was a little bit in a different way set up, which was there is an existing memorandum of understanding between IHE Delft and the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water. And by means of that memorandum of understanding, and also with the cooperation of the Embassy of the Netherlands in Bogota, we were making a kind of second part or follow-up of the previous project because of the reasons I am going to expose in a moment. And the new project is called BILCAT. So About PROCAT. PROCAT aimed to help the Ministry of Environment of Colombia to these 3 specific points. First, to identify and prioritize existing formulated projects of climate adaptation. And so the ministry had several projects, but they didn't know exactly what they have. They have many, and they do know about their quality, and specifically in 3 coastal deltas in Colombia. In principle, there were 6, but that was too much, and also it was in the middle of the pandemic, a bit difficult to carry out. And then the idea was to identify knowledge gaps that in the formulation of those projects. And also, well, a third point that was only achieved partly was promoting collaboration with Argentina as a particular member of this alliance and Delta Coalition. Here I would like to emphasize a little bit what Mr. Rabani was saying about the gender inclusiveness of the projects. And I'm happy to share that not only the team that was formed to do the project, but also the people involved in the field are majority women. These are common in Colombia, actually. It's not very difficult, and I think is not so common in the rest of the world. So the PROCAT project, we're studied the deltas of Patia, the delta of Sinú, and the delta of Magdalena. These 3 deltas, which are very special deltas, in particular Patia and Sinú, because these are not urbanized deltas. These are very rich deltas in terms of ecology and in terms of species, mangroves, birds, frogs, all kind of special things. And the communities that live there are quite poor, even though the land where they are is very rich in other aspects. And the Magdalena Delta, which is let's say the most developed one with big cities around, that is maybe the definition of delta that we all know more. So what we did was to come up with some methodology to characterize the quality of the projects, of the many projects they had in their databases, and came up with the methodology to evaluate them with the score. And then we prioritized the first that achieved the highest scores. That was basically the idea. I don't want to enter into the details, but this is the main idea. And part of the project was about communicating possible financial sources for these projects to be happening. And here, what we did was to mention some possible national and international funds. Interestingly, some of the national funds they knew, but not all, and definitely none of the international funds they were aware of. So this was very important to mention. And something else very important is that we also provide some examples of procedures on how to apply to these funds. We disseminated all these findings, or tried to disseminate these findings using webinars like this one. But as you can imagine, in these very difficult deltas, in terms of infrastructure, the connectivity was difficult, etc. So the real impact on the communities was not seen. So for that reason, we came up with the BuildCat project. So disseminate these results, really to go into the communities, to check with them, and also to share and to get feedback from their experiences. Also, quite female balanced team. Actually, I was the only male here in this team, but so it was a fantastic experience going into these communities, explaining what we found, and also making some workshops with them. And here again, I connect with Mr. Rabani in terms of analyzing needs and to go to the local ownership. So they were really focusing on the problems here. Also provided some of the tools that they could check about climate change. Also field trips, and there is this particular one in Barranquilla where they already have something for the public to check the possible impact of climate change in the future. And this is my final slide. So findings and lessons learned, and some of them are match quite well the previous speakers. First is local communities tend to focus on their immediate problems. And this is a problem because these communities still don't have their basic needs covered. And so they don't have safe drinking water, they don't have food, they lack connectivity. So they concentrate on short-term problems to be solved. So it's very difficult to let them see what are the bigger problems in the upcoming future. And this is a really, let's say, a challenge that we need to deal with. Second is working with local experts pays off. So we had a fantastic team of Colombian experts working on this project, and their products were fantastic. So and if we tend to here compare with the rates in the Netherlands or other countries, European countries, in terms of cooperation, that we should consider the local experts. And finally, building capacities in formulation of proposals is essential. So what we observe is that they lack a lot of capacity in terms of formulating projects, formulating good proposals. So we were encouraging communities to work together with universities to formulate proposals, and this is something we are planning to work as well in the upcoming future. And with this, I end up my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Leonardo. Just to confirm that IHE is one of my favorite institutions, and I actually did my master thesis in Colombia through IHE. So I visited Patia Delta, and it's indeed stunning, very ecologically rich, but also there's immediate needs in terms of drinking water and poverty reduction for the population. I also saw the strong women of Colombia, and thanks for highlighting the very feminist water sector in Colombia. I think the issue of formulating proposals for climate funds is a real one. We have together made an extremely complex system, and I understand why you need that compliance, etc. But it's important that we help local communities to access these funds. Let's go to our final presenter, Mr. Christopher Chong. He's a senior urban specialist at the Global Center for Adaptation and has 15 years of experience in resilience building and urban development, infrastructure and housing. Prior to joining GCA, Chris was a disaster risk management specialist at the World Bank, at the GFDRR, one of the most ugly acronyms I know. It's the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. I understand that it's just before 5 a.m. for Chris. I hope he had some coffee in the past half hour and woke up a little bit. Chris coordinates and manages the implementation of the GCA's Rapid Climate Risk Assessment in Africa's Cities program. And today, Chris will present a case study from Accra in Ghana on how to prioritize climate adaptation investment. Chris, maximum 10 minutes for you. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Michael. And good morning, everyone from San Francisco. It's a pleasure to be here. For the interest of time, I understand that we're a little bit over. I'm going to run through the presentation as quickly as possible so we can leave more time for discussion. But let me just pull up my presentation and we can begin. Okay. So good morning, everyone, again. And I'm here to basically speak about a process that we've been going through in Accra, Ghana. It's taken maybe about 1.5 years, whereby we came in with very little understanding of what the hazard context was in Accra, and eventually worked towards developing a prioritized climate adaptation list for investment. So basically, I'm going to walk you through the process of us first starting off with the risk assessment, then identifying specific projects for financing. Maybe just to quickly give you an overview of the challenges that are faced in Accra. Being in a delta, the unique geography in terms of its proximity to the sea as well as the river and its low-lying topography results in exposures that are similar to what you see in many other delta places. And so, with reference to the presentation given by Commissioner Glass, some of the climate challenges that you hear of are similar, whether you're in the Netherlands or in Ghana. It's largely stemming from flooding, as well as coastal erosion and water scarcity too, surprisingly. And in terms of impacts, here at GCA, we are obviously interested in the impacts across the entire geography, but understanding the disproportionate impacts of the most vulnerable is something that we do focus on, particularly informal settlements, whether these are communities on riverside and coastal areas or in floodplains. Just to give you some quick stats, I'm not going to dwell on this for too much, but just to give you an idea of the order of magnitude of the climate vulnerability of Accra, expected annual damage is expected to increase to 124 million by the 2030s. In terms of coastal erosion, there's an average of 0.5 meter that's lost per year to the sea. What this means by 2050 is that upwards to 650 square meters will be inundated due to sea level rise, and this will likely go up to 2.1 million square meters by 2080 if nothing is done. In terms of the differential impacts, on average, it's about 52 meters of coastal retreat across the entire shoreline by 2080, but in specific areas such as Glefe, this can be upwards to 161 million, which is pretty significant. In terms of water scarcity, even though per capita wise, there is sufficient water for the population of Accra, the climate variability means that places that used to have sufficient amounts of water may have less water. And so this brings into question, what are the resources that can be tapped into to provide water to specific communities? And then also that brings up the question of the infrastructure itself and that it's highly vulnerable to climate events such as flooding. To give you an overview of sort of the process that we went through, we started off with the risk assessment, which basically involved climate analysis as well as a lot of mapping based off of coastal erosion modeling, flood modeling, hazard exposure, and risk estimation from compound flooding. But the risk assessment also included a participatory aspect where we did work very closely with stakeholders in assessing the hazard and vulnerability in terms of validating the findings. So it's not just a bunch of people in the lab, but we brought this to the communities to basically validate whether or not these were in fact risks that they were encountering, but then also doing an assessment of public sector capacity in the government. Next, then we went into a gap analysis. What does that entail? Basically, it's doing a stock take of what is the current state and what is the desired state of water-related infrastructure in Accra. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? Then we identified specific challenges as well as opportunities for promoting climate adaptation. Then we generated a wide menu, almost like an encyclopedia of bankable investment options, everything that was identified in our discussions with government counterparts in terms of what they want to see. And then we did a cost estimation of each one of these specific options. When it comes to the investment prioritization, what we did was hosted a number of validation workshops with national as well as municipal stakeholders. So this involved the Accra Metropolitan Assembly, Regional Coordination Council, as well as national ministries. And then from these discussions, we developed a prioritized climate adaptation investment list. Basically a pitch book that the government of Ghana as well as the Accra municipality can go around with to different investors, whether they were MDBs, donors, or private sector, to basically identify this financing. Just to give you a quick overview, in terms of the scope, again, I want to emphasize that because it's a delta, here at GCA, we don't think that the problem is isolated to just the delta, but we look at the delta region, which is the greater Accra metropolitan area, but also adjacent river catchment areas. So we go both upstream and downstream. 20 project ideas were identified. We organized this into 6 different priorities, which you can see right here. And these were, and concept proposals were developed for each. For those of you who work in MDBs, it's, multilateral development finance, it's basically kind of like a project identification sheet. So these 6 sort of bundles or buckets that we identified of the many priorities was coastal protection and climate resilience, flood forecasting and early warning, the Denzu River Basin and Delta adaptation, focusing also on climate resilient water supply. Another bucket was low-income urban community revitalization adaptation, and then finally urban drainage and resilience. So after doing this costing exercise, basically we estimated that the total investment that's required is about 466 million. In terms of what would need to be leveraged from outside of the government resources, this is about 378 million. And then the project identification investment in total, about 23 million. I'm just going to do a very quick deep dive into the Denzu Basin and Delta Climate Adaptation project. And again, this is just a proposal. It's not actually financed, but basically we package it so that it's easy for an MDB to come in and say, okay, this is perfect. We're going to put our logo on it. In terms of the project rationale, soil erosion in the upper Denzu Basin has led to siltation of the reservoir upstream of Accra, the Weja Dam, the Weja Reservoir, which basically is the primary source of water, drinking water for Accra. What soil erosion results in essentially is siltation of the reservoir. Sorry, I said that already, but lower storage capacity as well as increased water scarcity for the city as a whole. But the idea too, though, is that because the storage capacity has been reduced, it requires the Weja Dam to be open, the floodgates to be open more frequently, which then leads to flooding of downstream communities. In terms of the strategic direction, what we identified with the stakeholders is a need to strengthen soil erosion control in the upper basins so that siltation gets reduced. But then also introducing protective measures for downstream communities so that as dam releases become frequent with more intense precipitation events, that this wouldn't necessarily lead to floods in these downstream communities. So again, the beneficiaries of this would be people, businesses, and assets in upper and lower basins, especially low-income communities and floodplains. And it also has a number of gender as well as climate mitigation co-benefits. This is just kind of an overview. I'm just gonna show it to you as a visual, not necessarily go into the details, but this is the type of analysis that we have done where we identify the area to be covered, the lead government agency as well as supporting government agencies, because it's not just a matter of finance, but also understanding the political economy environment, the institutional environment. And again, just to underscore that the capital expenditure for this, we're estimating to be about 72.6 million, of which 60 million would need to be leveraged from outside sources. This is just a quick overview in terms of the types of activities that we've identified, whether it's assessments or pre-feasibility studies, stakeholder consultations, updates to spatial planning, as well as investments in flood defenses. For example, dikes, levees, but then also nature-based solutions such as such as wetlands.
Chris, can you wrap up so we have a bit of time for Q&A?
Yes. So here we are with the budget in terms of what the costing is. This is the institutional mapping that we've done. Maybe just to end with the quick lessons learned, and I'll admit that I'm an urban planner by training, so that probably demonstrates the bias that I have in terms of the lessons that I think are worth highlighting. But just to mention that again, the delta's relationship with rivers requires an understanding of addressing challenges at a basin level. It's not just isolated to the to the delta itself, but a need to have to look more upstream as well too. One thing that we've noticed that due to the unique geography of deltas that we find similar challenges, whether it's flooding, coastal erosion, water scarcity, jurisdictions. So when we say we have to look at the basin level, it also entails that we have to work with a lot of different actors at different levels of jurisdictions, whether it's municipal, regional, and national governments. And so this is something that's really important to understand, because the ability to access finance isn't necessarily just about the money itself, like who's going to give the money, but also about the institutions that exist within. And then lastly, which I didn't cover too much, but something I think important to highlight is that by identifying revenue generation potential of specific investments, this can then also help identify the appropriate financier, whether it's the private sector or an MDB or a donor. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. And I think these lessons learned are things that resonate with the other presentation as well. No, I mean, if you think about different jurisdictions, we heard that in Colombia, we heard that in Bangladesh, we heard that in the Netherlands. And also this idea of revenue generation, it's the difference between who pays and who finances, and also important for sustainable financing and operation and maintenance at least. So we'll now move into the panel discussion. We'll take about 15 minutes for that. Can I ask all the speakers to put on their cameras if you haven't yet? There is a Q&A for this session. If you have questions, please add it there. I cannot guarantee I can ask all the questions, but I'm sure the panel members can either type into the Q&A or later on we'll answer your questions by email. So invitation to do that. Let me first ask a question actually to Leonardo. Your CV is very much on data. And on the other hand, in Colombia, you've worked in deltas with very few data, very little information. So a lack of data is often a barrier to climate adaptation strategies. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the lack of data? And what's the importance of investing in better data? But we can't wait. So how do you deal with that dilemma of bad data and still having to act? Leonardo, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Very important question and a very difficult one to answer, because indeed, without data, we cannot generate information. Without information, we cannot increase our knowledge. And without that knowledge, we cannot make proper decisions. So data is the starting point from that perspective. We actually, one of the approaches we also try to do is using citizen science. Now there are some cases where citizen science is not the right tool to collect data per se, but some data is collected, and also at the same time the communities are involved, are engaged, starting to understand what is going on with their surroundings. So that's one of the strong research activities we do here at IHE in different countries. For these projects in Colombia, we haven't applied that yet, but there is a potential on doing so.
Thanks. Thanks for being brief, Leonardo. Let me take it for there and actually go to Dr. Rabbani. I mean, RAC is internationally very well known for its stakeholder engagement and its good relationship with communities. Leonardo already talked about citizen data. How do you think that engagement with local stakeholders, local communities, and informal economy workers can accelerate the equitable adaptation in poor communities? Because adaptations, we don't want to leave anybody behind. So how do we deal with that, Dr. Rabbani?
Thank you so much. This is an excellent question, actually. I mean, this is, very important when you, support on adaptation projects, to be implemented in a vulnerable community. So, and this is being currently, integrated, as I was saying during my presentation, in the concept note stage, we make the first criteria to design the project by the NGOs is to go to the target communities and ask them what are the current problems they are facing, related to climate change, and what are their basic needs to address those problems. So, once you discuss with the community, why don't you engage the community leaders in that discussion? And once you get the, ideas, needs, challenges, and potential solution, and communities are very, well aware about what kind of solutions that can be, helpful to adapt with these climate challenges. And once you get those ideas, you also need to discuss with the local authorities and other sectors so that they understand the problems, and these are aligned with the policies, local policies, and the national plans. So this is how we currently engage those relevant stakeholders, so that the NGOs, private sectors, local community leaders, and local government authorities, including the target communities, so that they identify the needs and they can address their own problems with some funding support from the Climate Bridge Fund. That's how we are currently dealing with.
Thank you. Let me turn to Peter Glas. You talked a little bit about how in the Netherlands you mobilize private sector financing through bonds. You've now listened to experiences from Ghana, from Bangladesh, from Colombia. Of course, these are very different countries, but they also face similar projects in their delta. So how would you see what would be necessary to actually raise private sector financing into these different countries for climate resilience in different deltas? Over to you, Peter.
Well, that's the million or the billion-dollar question, I suppose, how to do this. And I do realize that we in the Netherlands we are in a state of economic development, and budgetary conditions are favorable to maintain this investment flow, if you will, with public funding, be it that a lot of the capital is raised on the capital markets, but then again it translates into tariffs and taxes that are raised, and you made the calculus, 500 euros per capita per year, and I think that's about right. So I'm always impressed to hear about the experiences in countries like Bangladesh and Colombia and other places, and how you are managing to still raise awareness and engage people, and try to use the Green Fund and other international banks that are developing these programs, these portfolios for climate adaptation. Actually, I'm very much interested in this, what was mentioned, also the blended finance as a means of combining public and private capital. And I do think that even in a country like the Netherlands, although a lot of the work is public and publicly financed in the end, the need for businesses to start moving is immense. And maybe the Netherlands can learn a lot from other countries where the public sector is not so developed and has less opportunities. We can learn from you how you actually engage the private sector in reaching those goals. So I'm more the one that is asking the questions, perhaps, than providing the answers, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, I didn't expect you to have an answer on private financing for climate adaptation off the cuff for the whole world, Peter. So thanks very much for those thoughts. Let me turn to the Ghana team, and except Chris Chung, we've also Bertha Darte with us, who's also on the team. You also highlighted, like what Peter said, actually the need for revenue generation, no tariffs, taxes, etc. So maybe I can turn to you, Bertha, and can you tell us a little bit about what's the kind of revenue generation that there's already in Ghana or planned in Ghana? And yeah, that's the base for financing, but how do you see that situation right now, and what's going on to raise some revenues, if not for investment, at least for operation and maintenance?
Well, thank you very much for your question. For a country like Ghana, a lot of our challenges have to do with limited revenue. And if you have heard, I mean, we just recently signed on to an IMF program because we've had a lot of challenges locally. So I think revenue generation is something that the government is really pushing on. And recently, 3 new taxes, for example, have been introduced to see how we can raise revenue. And as part of this IMF program, one of the things that came up recently was how to even make sure that we are charging the right tariffs when it comes to water supply in order to get the utility to be able to maintain and be able to also pay back debts on investment. So currently, we are moving a lot closer towards cost recovery, even though it affects a lot of the poor. But government is also asking, let's say, the utility to balance the needs of the poor, as well as the need to raise the tariffs to be able to ensure adequate cost recovery. So for us, I think we are already putting in place measures to address the revenue generation. Also at the local level, every municipal assembly or metropolitan assembly is given the opportunity to put in the necessary taxes and charges and fines to be able to raise revenue locally. But apart from the local revenue we raise, a lot of funding for climate adaptation often comes from external partnerships and donors. And so, like Chris said, we've had to develop this pitch book, and we are looking forward to reach out to various donors, multilaterals, to be able to support us to make the needed investment. So it's going to be a mix of both local revenue, which is not going to be too much, also looking at our exchange rates, but also based on concessionary financing and some perhaps commercial finance. Maybe Chris can go more into that, but we are looking at whether there's opportunity for some of the projects to have their own revenue streams to supplement the financing and also be able to maintain the facilities or investments adequately. I'll hand over to Chris if he has anything else to add.
I'm actually going to hand it back to myself, given the
Okay.
time. Sorry, Chris. I think in terms of revenue mobilization, what's always important to realize is that very often people talk about willingness to pay. But we all know that the poor often pay much more for alternative water supply. They suffer the most when there's flood damage, etc. So let's also keep in mind the idea of willingness to charge. It's often governments who are not willing to charge while citizens are willing to pay, especially in the time of elections, when suddenly water tariffs, energy tariffs, everything is reduced. I know that's the case in Ghana sometimes, Bertha. Yeah. I'm looking whether Dr. Almadi is still there from the Green Climate Fund. Are you still there, Dr. Almadi?
He's dropped off.
Oh, because I had the question, what's he going to fund? But then I can't ask him that. So we'll all send the mail to Dr. Almadi, because I think we've seen really good examples of different ways of helping communities to actually, or governments, local government, national governments, to think through what climate change will mean for deltas, and to translate those needs into workable propositions that now needs to be financed. I just want, Peter, just going back to you, as you reflect on this, do you have any other good examples of adaptation? You think we've missed anything in this discussion, which has been very rich, but also limited, of course, also by the time?
Well, perhaps this was about finance, basically. But I'm also a practitioner of water management for 40 years now, and I've seen the changes And so to go back to the physics almost, working with the forces of nature, nature-based solutions. I think in the end, those are the most resilient and best solutions for the future. So that would be my wish almost after 40 years, that a combination of civil engineering and all the financing that goes with hardcore concrete, etc., but also try to invest in those nature-based solutions, and to have that combination. That would be my wish, at least for the future.
Okay, thanks very much. I actually would like to add a third leg to the stool. No stool with two legs, just the physical and the financial will drop. And I think the third leg that we've seen in this discussion is really the social leg. It is about humans, it is about communities. And I think if we can bring together that finance, we can bring together the engineering, not fighting nature, but really working with nature and nature-based solutions, but also working with communities. There's a lot to be done. And I'm very impressed by all the work done and all the experience there is. And I think this really proves that exchanging between different communities, between different countries, there's something to be learned from each country to the other. I'm going to hand over to Olivia. I know it's just past 2:30, but she just has a few words on how to engage with the community in the future. And after that, I'll close the session. Olivia, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be very quick. I just wanted to let everyone know the next webinar in this series of webinars is going to be on June 16th at the same time. The topic for this one is Resilient Delta Cities, Adaptation, Analysis, Planning, and Implementation. We also wanted to welcome everyone here to join our new Water Adaptation Community LinkedIn group. I'll post that in the chat. It's a space to share opportunities, seek knowledge, and just connect further. On our microsite of the Water Adaptation Community, there's 4 communities of practice: urban climate resilience, adaptation in deltas, adaptation on small islands, and adaptation of coastal areas. So you can join those and share resources there as well. You can also find on our site a link to sign up for our newsletter to make sure you get updates from us about the IPDC and about more webinars. We're actually going to have 2 more webinars beyond the Delta City one happening in June. So a very busy webinar month for us. And I'll also share today's recording and the slide decks on the website as well. So I'll paste all those links in the chat right now. And that's all from me. Thank you. Back to you, Micah. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks again to all the speakers. My lasting thought is about finance, because we all need to do broader projects. We all need to be translating these needs into bankable projects. But in the end, there is not enough finance right now, no? Over a decade ago in Paris, rich countries pledged 100 billion per year for climate finance. That hasn't materialized. We know that from climate finance, the vast majority goes to climate mitigation and very little to climate adaptation. So we need to keep working on all these good ideas, but we also need to think what are the extra financing resources we need so that the poorest are not left behind. We can think about innovative ways of raising private sector capital, but in the end, climate adaptation is very much a public good that we all share a responsibility for. So governments need to step up to serve their own citizens and to serve the citizens all around the world. With those words, thanks very much. It's been a very inspiring afternoon, and I wish you all a great weekend, and we look forward to the next session, Olivia. So bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Micah, so much for chairing. Goodbye.